This cell, like all cells, is surrounded by a layer known as the cell membrane. In this video, we will investigate the form and function of this structure because it is critical to cells being able to maintain homeostasis. To start off and to appreciate the function of the cell membrane, you have to remember that cells exchange materials with their environment. Here is a very simplified cell. Cells need to take in certain materials, like oxygen and nutrients. Cells also need to get rid of certain materials, like waste or products that they make for other cells, or carbon dioxide, a specific type of waste. There are also some materials that should never leave the cell, like DNA, and then there are other materials that should never enter the cell, like toxins. So let's investigate how the membrane does this. And in order to understand its function, you have to also remember that those materials we were just looking at vary in their charges. For example, some molecules, like water, are polar. They've got a slight charge. And then there are other molecules, like ions, which have full charges. In contrast, there are nonpolar molecules, like ethane and other hydrocarbons, that don't have a charge at all because they share their electrons equally. And these different materials follow certain rules of attraction. For example, polar molecules and charged molecules are attracted to each other because the opposite charges attract. So for example, here we can see that the positive hydrogen atoms in a water molecule are attracted to the negative chlorine molecule. Meanwhile, the negative oxygen atoms in water are attracted to the positive sodium ion. And this is one reason why sodium chloride, aka salt, dissolves so easily in water. Similarly, water molecules are also attracted to each other because water molecules are polar. On the other hand, nonpolar molecules do not like, in fact, they repel polar and charged molecules. And that's going to be very important later on. So what does the cell membrane do exactly that makes it so important to homeostasis? Well, the first thing is that it's a boundary between the cell, the inside of the cell, and its environment. Perhaps the most important thing it does, though, is control what enters and leaves the cell. And that's a trait known as being selectively permeable. To be selective means to pick and to choose. To be permeable means to pass. So the membrane is picking and choosing what can go in and out of the cell. And finally, the cell membrane can communicate with other cells. And we'll find out how that works a little bit later in the year. So now let's zoom in on the structure of the cell membrane. Here we're looking up close at just a small little patch of the membrane, and we can already see an interesting feature to its structure. It kind of looks like a sandwich, where these round molecules are like the bread of the sandwich, and then these linear molecules are kind of like the fillings of the sandwich. So let's see what those are. Here's a more detailed look at the cell membrane. Now keep in mind though, we're just looking at a little patch. So if this is the entire cell, we're slicing into a tiny, tiny piece of the cell membrane. And we can see that there is a lot going on. In fact, almost all of the organic molecules are found in the cell membrane. We've got proteins, we've got carbohydrates, and then we've got fatty acids as well. So here's a slightly simpler look at the cell membrane. The most numerous component of the cell membrane is the phospholipid. And a phospholipid is made up of a phosphate head, those are the gray circles, attached to two fatty acid tails. And there are lots of phospholipids in the bilayer, and in fact they form two different layers called the phospholipid bilayer. And those are kind of like the bread of the sandwich. But then, here and there in the bilayer are protein molecules. And they're embedded in a pretty much random fashion, and they can be different in different cells. And because of this overall structure, the cell membrane is known to be a fluid mosaic because the proteins are stuck in the phospholipids, but both the proteins and the phospholipids can move around, although you can't tell that from this stationary image. Let's take a closer look at the phospholipid bilayer because this is really the key to the cell membrane's function. Is it just an accident that all the phosphates are on the outside of the membrane while the fatty acids are on the inside? No, it's not an accident. It has to do with the fact that there's water outside of the cell and there's water inside of the cell. And if we zoom in on a phospholipid, we can see that the phosphate head is hydrophilic. What that really means is that the phosphate head is polar or charged, so it likes water. Meanwhile, the fatty acid tails are nonpolar. They hate water, so in order to hide from water, the fatty acid tails are sandwiched on the inside and the phosphate heads are found on either exterior so that they can interact with water. And this close-up shows you how the phosphate heads right here are attracting to the different water molecules. Meanwhile, the fatty acids that are hydrophobic stay safe on the inside away from water. Now, this feature helps the phospholipid bilayer be selectively permeable. And here's how it works. These fatty acid tails, because they're nonpolar, are going to block anything else that's polar or really big from entering the membrane. So here we've got some ions that are charged. The fatty acid tails don't like them, and so they block them. Meanwhile, we've got some big molecules. This could be a protein, and it's also too large to squeeze through the fatty acid bilayer. However, the fatty acids will let certain molecules through. They'll let small molecules, like water, and they'll let non-charged molecules, like carbon dioxide and oxygen, through the bilayer. So what if you're a big molecule or a charged molecule? Does that mean that you never enter or you never leave the cell membrane? Well, no, you've got a way around it, and it's the proteins. So here we can see in this diagram, nonpolar small molecules get to just squeeze right through the cell membrane from one side to the other. However, if you're a large molecule, you're going to enter the membrane through a protein that kind of acts like a door or a channel. If you're a charged molecule, you'll also enter or exit through a protein. And similarly, water molecules, even though they can squeeze through, they'll go through much faster if they're going through a protein, and that's because of their charge. So here we have, in a nutshell, the cell membrane's structure and function. And in class, we'll take a look at the cell membrane and see if it can really be the foundation for an anti-aging serum. But in the meantime, make sure that your notes are complete and you take the poll.